Hello, my name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. This is a great installment in Project Poirot because we are finally to Death on the Nile, which is just such a good book. And I also want to make sure I talk a little bit about the movie version. I don't think it quite merits its own video, but I certainly want to highlight that to you guys. So let's just dive right into this. Usual disclaimer, if you've never watched one of these videos before, you don't need to worry about spoilers. I usually take the summary up through roundabouts when we find a body. In this case, I'm actually not going to get to the point where we find a body because I think it's far enough into the story that you should figure out who dies on your own. But there's not going to be any spoilers, so don't worry about that. If you've not read it, you can certainly keep watching. So with that, let's get into this. So this book is set in 1937, and we do quite a bit of globe trotting because, as the title suggests, we definitely go to Egypt, to the Nile. We start off in England. There's some scenes in America. There's some scenes in Jerusalem. We're just going all over the place. But anyway, the story centers around a young American heiress named Lynette Ridgway, who is 20. She is a bright young thing, basically. She's not, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, she's not actively cruel, but she's certainly very spoiled and therefore acts quite thoughtlessly a lot. But, you know, she has a variety. She's very popular. She's beautiful. She's rich. She's smart. Essentially, the comment that's made over and over again is that basically she has it all, and a lot of people feel like that's not totally fair. So that maybe is kind of her biggest flaw, is being unaware of her own privilege. But anyway, so we open with her, and she's just bought this new manor in England, and she has so many friends, but one of them who's dropping by to kind of chat with her and ask for a favor is Jacqueline de Belfort. Now, Jacqueline is the daughter of a French count and an American heiress, but we come to realize that she has lost all of her money essentially because of the Great Depression. So Jacqueline is very hard up. She's scraping by on 200 pounds a year, and she, however, does have one thing going for her, and that is that she is madly in love with the younger son of a lord named Simon Doyle. Simon has recently been let go from his job, essentially because of the Great Depression, so he's looking for work, and Jacqueline comes to Lynette and says, hey, you just bought this big estate. Please let Simon be the estate manager. We can see each other all the time. You're going to love him. He's going to be great. Please, will you hire him? So Lynette, again, because she's not actively cruel, she doesn't try to be cruel, she agrees to take him on. They fall in love almost immediately and get married within a month. And so within a month, she is going on her honeymoon. One thing that should be noted is that she was set to inherit the rest of her money upon turning 21 or her marriage. So she kind of accelerated the date at which she got the rest of her money by getting married. So they get married, and Jacqueline has nothing else in her life, so she becomes kind of twisted with rage and just completely fixated on the fact that the love of her life and her best friend have run off together. And so Simon and Lynette are going on a honeymoon tour throughout kind of the exotic Middle East, and everywhere they go, no matter how many times they think they've lost her, Jacqueline shows up and starts just pestering them and trying to essentially just make them miserable and never able to forget that they both betrayed her. So that's kind of the backstory, and we join the two of them on their honeymoon in Egypt, and they finally think that they found a way to escape Jacqueline, and that is to go on a river cruise down the Nile on a tugboat, steamboat thing called the Karnak. And I don't want to give more away of the plot. I just want to make sure you kind of know who some of these characters are when I start talking about them. So there is a plethora of really well fleshed out, very interesting characters in this book. A representative sampling of them include Miss Van Schuyler, who is a rich old American snob who is known for her kind of opulence. She has a companion named Miss Bowers, and she's also brought along a poor relation named Miss Robson, who she treats both of them very badly. There is a young communist. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he essentially became a communist at Oxford, but he's still rich, so there's a little dichotomy there. There is an Austrian doctor named Dr. Besner. There is a romance, sensationalist novelist named Salome Otterborn, who is basically an alcoholic and kind of in the last stages of depression and alcoholism, and that's pretty sad. And she has like a daughter named Rosalie who is with her and who just like really kind of resents her mom at this point for how miserable she's making her. There are the Allertons, a mother and son pair who I believe are Jacqueline's either friends or cousins. I can't remember which, but they know Jacqueline. And who else is on this lovely voyage down the Nile? There's a lot of others. It's a pretty large cast that she's dealing with in this book. But anyway, what you need to know is that eventually someone does die. And well, the other person you need to know about, Hercule Poirot is on this trip. That is how it's a Poirot book. And Colonel Race is on this trip. And we met him in Cards on the Table. I think we'll meet him one or two other times, but both of them are also on this trip, seemingly by accident, if I remember correctly. They kind of bump into each other. So both of them are there as well. So what you really need to know in terms of plot from here on in is just basically, it's called A Death on the Nile. Someone's die. It's very fast paced once you actually get on the boat, and a lot of shit goes down. So it is one I don't want to spoil because it is really one of her very best books, and the movie is also good, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And it's really worth reading or seeing if you have the opportunity to do so. So there are so many directions I could take this in because there's just a lot happening in this book and a lot of really interesting kind of subtext and kind of clues into the time and place that this was written. Because it's 1937, and just because I think this is the most interesting angle on this, the primary thing I want to talk about essentially is the impact of the Great Depression and how that background is used to characterize Lynette. So 37, we're in the throes of the Depression. This is pre-World War II, even for the UK. And as I've mentioned, there's already kind of two, like just in the setup, kind of implications or fallout from the Great Depression. One, Jacqueline grew up in wealth. Like, her mother was an heiress, and she comes from a privileged background. She's the daughter of a count, a French count. However, she is destitute, basically. I mean, she's scraping by on 200 pounds a year, and it's because of the Great Depression. So her family lost their entire fortune in the Great Depression. So there's that. So she's been put in this situation because of the Great Depression. And then Simon has lost his job basically because of the Great Depression. And even though he's the younger son of a lord, he is basically destitute. So this, that tells you something about what's happening with the Depression, but it also just tells you about the waning power of the aristocracy, right? So Lynette, and again, we have this American versus kind of aristocracy, British aristocracy tension happening, as we have seen, in a number of books at this point. I mean, Lord Edgeware Dies is a great example of one where we see some kind of discussion of this, but we see them and they've completely lost everything because of this. And then Lynette has emerged unscathed and actually is flourishing. So keep in mind, Jacqueline is able to live on 200 pounds a year. She buys a used car for 15 pounds. So think about what dollar value that is. Meanwhile, Lynette has just purchased a old English manor for 60,000 pounds. Just cuz, and then spent another 50,000 renovating it. And again, she bought it from an English lord who was impoverished. So again, we see a real theme of kind of old versus new money, the implications of the aristocracy already being on its kind of last legs, and then the Depression really throwing things off. And what we see in Lynette is that she is essentially, her fatal flaw is her own privilege and her inability to really understand her privilege. So, for instance, she renovates this whole place in this small English town, and there's a real implication from several comments that are made that the townspeople are pretty resentful of what she's doing to the manor and the fact that she's able to spend that kind of money doing it. For instance, she also tears down a bunch of old cottages, and she states initially that she's doing it for a benevolent reason of, oh, well, they were so old and the sanitation wasn't great. But also it's because they would have been in the sight of the new pool that she's putting in. And she doesn't really have any empathy for the fact that, yeah, maybe they were old, but, like, there are people who, like, have lived there their entire lives, that they may not want to have moved from where they were at. So there's this sort of sense that she's spoiled to the degree, not that it makes her necessarily an actively bad person, but that makes her very thoughtless and blind to how other people are perceiving her. And ultimately this becomes, like, essentially she doesn't realize how much risk she's putting herself in because of that. All the characters that I mentioned that are on the boat with her, what you come to realize is that almost all of them have a reason to resent her or resent her family. And she, again, is quite blind to this because she's just so focused on sort of this bubble that she lives in. Poirot at one point makes a very astute observation. This is one of the few, not few, but I wouldn't say there's a ton of direct biblical references in Christie, not in the way that there are in some other authors, but essentially the parable from, I guess it'd be Samuel, where David is told the story about this rich, super rich king who had flocks and flocks of sheep, and he takes the one ewe that this poor man has, who has raised this as like a member of the family, and he slaughters it. And essentially Poirot kind of raises that as the analogous situation for Lynette and Jacqueline, that Jacqueline has almost nothing left. The only thing that she really had in her life was this great love with Simon. And Simon is described pretty much as like a very wishy-washy kind of guy, like just sort of impetuous, and he's also spoiled in his own way because of his upbringing, even though he now finds himself very poor until he marries Lynette. And, he's essentially described as essentially having like a weak character, but Lynette is not described as having a weak character. Really, it's the two women in this kind of triangle who are the real, like, centers of strength. And Poirot basically sees Lynette as being, her thoughtlessness has caused her to do something that was really profoundly, like, wrong and evil. I mean, if your best friend stole your fiance, like, that's just on its face, that's a hard story, but like in the context of Jacqueline's whole life and her kind of feelings about Simon, it becomes something that's just really, like, thoughtlessly cruel. And the fact that Lynette does not ever really have sympathy for Jacqueline is something that's sort of an indictment on her character. She basically, I think she's essentially of the mindset of like, yeah, that sucks, but like, hey, we're in love, so you kind of just need to get over it. And, I would say that does not necessarily display a huge amount of empathy for other people. There's a number of other points where the Great Depression comes in, and I just realized that I probably shouldn't get into the details because it would start to get a little bit spoilery. But suffice it to say, there's a number of people who are put in situations at the end of it, essentially because of the Great Depression, that they have been left in a financial situation that has caused them to make certain choices because of the Great Depression. And I think that this book is, unless I'm proved wrong by one of the upcoming books, but I would say that maybe this book is the most kind of pointed sort of exploration of the fallout of the Great Depression among the upper class. The only other thing I wanted to bring up is that we definitely do have some xenophobia and some just like gross colonialism stuff. Like Poirot, I think one time described some of the locals in Egypt as like a swarm of flies of humanity or something. Like, it's just gross, it's not cute, and I get that it's anachronistic to expect something different, but like, to a modern reader, that is just very jarring. And then also the fact that Jacqueline is half French. Often there's there's an otherness to her, especially with respect to, Americans may be crass and young and whatever, but they're still, like, they come from good English stock, I think is sort of the implication. Whereas Jacqueline, she has this fiery temper. She is, so passionately committed to this revenge against these people who have wronged her. And there's a lot of discussion about how that's like her Latin temper, basically. There's an allusion made to the fact that I think at one point when she was young, she stabbed someone with a penknife because they wouldn't stop hurting an animal. And there's this sense that Jacqueline is, maybe she's too much for this world almost. Like, she's too passionate, she loves too deeply, she feels wrongs too deeply. And I think that I think that Jacqueline de Belfort is maybe one of the most interesting characters that Agatha Christie ever wrote. She's incredibly complex. She is, I think, a variant of the Mary Debenham type that I've been alluding to, and I just find her really fascinating. Every time I reread this book, I kind of have a new appreciation for that particular character, and almost the same way for Lynette. Not because Lynette is super complicated, but just, I think, this is a real character study of two different types of powerful women, and I think it's just fascinating. On a character level, this book to me is extremely successful. And then finally, before I wrap up, I do just want to do a huge shout out to the movie version of Death on the Nile. Not the David Suchet version. I forget who plays Poirot. Oh, Peter Ustinov plays Poirot. I don't know that he's that successful at playing Poirot, but what's his face plays Colonel Race, and he is fantastic. I can see his face. He's in Murder by Death. But anyway, so he is a very good Colonel Race. Angela Lansbury is slaying the game as Salome Otterborn. She is everything in this movie. Like, watch this movie just for Angela Lansbury, giving, like, the fucking performance of a lifetime. I recommend this movie purely just based on that performance. She is so good in it. Bette Davis plays Miss Van Skyler, and she looks like an actual corpse. It is hella creepy. It was a movie that was made by the same production company that made the original Murder on the Orient Express, and this movie is not as good as Murder on the Orient Express, but Mia Farrow plays Jacqueline de Belfort, and she's really good as that character. But I guess what I'm saying is it's an all-star cast, just like the Murder on the Orient Express was, and they just do a really nice job of evoking the time and place. I think it's just a really well-made movie that's very, very entertaining. And actually, just quick fun fact, because Angela Lansbury played this role in this movie, the same production company later cast her as Miss Marple in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, and because of her performance in that movie, they were inspired to write the TV show Murder, She Wrote, about, like, centered around Angela Lansbury as a Miss Marple type. So basically, the reason, like, the Murder on the Orient Express original adaptation is the reason why we got Murder, She Wrote, indirectly. So anyway, that concludes most of what I have to say about this book. Here's my ranking. Obviously, I have this very, very high. I think I ended up putting it above Lord Edgeware Dies, so, or maybe even above Mysterious Ferret Styles. I don't know, take a look. But I just really was reminded at how great this book is. It's one of her masterpieces. I would put it right up there with Cards on the Table and a couple of the other ones that I've just said I think are amazing. I love the hell out of this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, 7 out of 7 unicorns. It's so, so good, and I highly, highly recommend it. So if you have read this book, please let me know what you thought below. Even if you disagree with me and didn't like it as much, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you did enjoy this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all of that information listed in the description box below. And I think that that's gonna do it. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!